We're very fortunate that President Cohen is going to join us on the panel, which means that when the questions and answers, when you want to ask us any questions, please feel free to ask him questions as well. And I'm addressing here the students over here. The other thing I wanted to say, if you notice, this panel, in the last two panels, we had the moderator first sitting on one end and the second panel on the other end. Over here, I decided I'm going to sit in the middle because what we want to have is not presentations by the panelists, but actually a discussion. And I would like you to be joining in the discussion, and I would like the students in particular, since this panel is about you, it is about education. And if you feel comfortable enough to move in front, there's so many chairs here in front, please do move over to the front so that you can join if you feel like it. If you're too shy, you can stay where you are. I thought what I would do here, I actually have a very interesting panel. I have, apart from the president, I have two people from academia, from this university, and two people who are actors in the private sector. So we're going to have a wonderful interaction between the two. But, and what I would like to do is to introduce them very quickly. Here on my immediate left, I have Pradeep Khosla. He's the Dean of the College of Engineering and the Philip and Marcia Dowd University Professor at the Carnegie Mellon. On my left, yeah, more left. I have, there's Shannon Schuyler. She's the Managing Director of Corporate Responsibility for PricewaterhouseCoopers. On my immediate right is Thomas Spiller, and despite his name, he's French. And he's the Senior Director of International Programs, and he told me not to say SAS, it's SAS. And further to my right is Professor Susan Polanski, who teaches Hispanic Studies and is the head of the Department of Modern Languages here at Carnegie Mellon. Before I turn to the discussants over here, I thought I would draw your attention and create the context for some of the discussion that's going to take place now by summarizing the three papers by the three contributors who are not here on the podium with us today. All of them very interesting, and the other contributors are here so they can speak for themselves. But there are three very good papers. Russell Berman argues for restarting the engine of globalization, something that we have been talking about today all morning, particularly as it had run out of steam with the recent global economic meltdown. He does acknowledge the anxieties that globalization triggers because of the labor mobility, which brings different cultures and languages into contact. And he concludes with several recommendations in order to prepare the future international workforce. And these recommendations range from learning a second language, and I think we're going to be hearing about that, more about that from Susan here, and cultural immersion courses, which are very important, to promoting universalist and liberal democratic principles. He goes on to stress the importance of teaching the humanities and the liberal arts, and I think we'll hear about that, more about that later on as well. And by doing that, he's warning against a narrow focus on technological training, I suppose. The second paper I read was by Robert Duggar, and he bases his argument on research that demonstrates the benefit that early childhood education yields in the form of increased labor productivity, competitiveness, economic growth, and job creation. And he recommends that governments invest more in high-quality early childhood programs. And I feel that even the developed countries have not really invested enough in early childhood programs. The paper by Arthur Rothkopf laments the failure of the US educational system to prepare students for the 21st century through quality education, and in particular for failing to orient them and equip them for the growth occupations in the sciences, technology, engineering, and mathematics, the STEM. He actually He contrasts the anticipated 28.8% growth of employment in professional and scientific and technical services by 2016, which will actually add 2.1 million jobs, with the contraction of the degrees in these fields that are conferred by US institutions. And he goes on to say specifically that American students are actually only just above 50% of those who actually get these degrees. And he contrasts that with the contraction in conferring both master and bachelor degrees. He does see signs of improvement with policies encouraging education reforms, but he argues that more needs to be done. And to address the challenges of this new millennium, Dean Kostler argues that the world needs more scientists and engineers, not only in the United States, but in other countries, because no single country can actually produce the numbers that are needed. And he cites the success of the American Research University, but admits that it's not going to be easily replicated in other countries. And this raises a number of questions that I would like to ask of the discussants over here. And the first one that comes to my mind, it seems to me that most of these papers were actually focusing on the United States and Europe. And I think Dean Kostler comes up with a very important issue, that this is not going, what is happening in the United States is not going to be possible everywhere. It may be possible in some places, but it cannot be replicated everywhere. And the question is, how is that going to actually increase the gap between the developed countries and the developing countries? And and particularly as we're talking about the G20 that is looking not only at the developed country but at the whole world, what can be done over here, and what are the recommendations, or at least what are the questions that we need to be asking to be able to counter some of these gaps that are going to take place. The other thing that comes to my mind again is in looking at this focus and these jobs that are going to be created, whether in the developed or developing countries, in terms of mathematics, sciences, and etc. It's an area where women are not necessarily encouraged to invest in. And what does that mean in terms of the gender gap, in terms of job finding? Does that mean that, you know, most of these jobs, which are going to be probably in the private sector, although obviously in the public sector as well, does that mean that we're going to end up seeing a feminization of the public sector, for example? And I throw these questions first, starting with the person who actually brings up this whole issue where this cannot be replicated everywhere.
Thank you, Sahar. So before I start, I should tell you that I'm not an economist, but what I've learned in my life, or short life out here, is that an economist and a non-economist has nearly equal probability of being right on any issue that has to do with economics. Right? But somehow this is not working. So what you read out there, op-ed piece, and based on the following observation, again picking up from newspapers, if you look at the role of economic development, I don't think it is only to make rich people richer. It's also in the underdeveloped countries to bring people out of poverty. So now if you take just an example, China, just for China to maintain status quo, where about 700 plus million people are still below nearly poverty level. They have to maintain growth rates of 8 to 10, status quo is about 6%, a reasonable number of people to come out of poverty is between 8 and 10%. These are not reasonable growth rates in a global economic sense. And up to now, post-World War II, my conjecture, right or wrong, somebody can correct me, is the US has been the main driver of innovation, creation of ideas, creation of wealth, and it has spread it around the whole world pretty much. Other countries have followed up, but not enough. And now these other countries like China, India, I think the African region have to pick up and invest in their education infrastructure and replicate a model, which I don't think is the only model, but that's the only model I know which has demonstrated success, which is the American Research University model, and has been extremely successful. So that was my basis. So I don't think it's impossible to replicate that model, and this would be a question to Jerry, as he's been thinking about internationalization and investing a lot in our international activities. Maybe he can throw some light on how he thinks that we have actually changed the culture in some of these places. But we are talking about a program in Africa right now, starting from scratch, to create economic development using mainly ICT technologies, right? And this is part of a country and in a region where STEM education is much less valued than in the US or in India or China, where I think women's rights are a bigger problem than one would think about. But I think these are the types of places we have to be going into to really make a powerful impact, have a higher return on investment, on our investment of our time, to change the world around us. So.
I don't have much to add to what Pradeep just said, other than my own observation that this, there's an interesting question as to how many research universities the world can afford, or how many does it need. In fact, there's a study being undertaken by the National Academy of Sciences to try to answer that question from the US perspective again, but it'll be generalizable. One of the moments in time I recall, which is instructive, was a time when, I'm not sure just why it happened then, I think it was probably during the 70s. It seemed that every public university in every state felt that it should be a full-fledged research university. And actually the state of Wisconsin set out to do that. And they already had like a dozen state colleges. And they realized very quickly they'd go broke before they could ever pursue that. Now, it's not, from a US perspective, it's not hard to understand why. Every college wants to be a university, and every university wants to be Harvard, or probably Carnegie Mellon. So there's that drive for stature, and stature is tended to be defined as a research university. And that's crazy. We can't afford that. But it requires tough decisions. It's particularly interesting, I think, from a developing country point of view, where there's huge educational needs, and that what simply cannot be or won't be delivered by a single research university. So some mix of educational institutions is called for. I don't think we have any sense of what that mix ought to be, or even how to go about answering the question.
Well, I just want to add a point to that discussion, which is indeed, and thanks for your word about technology, because that's my background and that's what I do now, is that if you look at Africa, for instance, where the large populations, groups of population who do not have access to basic education at all, because lack of infrastructure, lack of resources, lack of money. We and a number of other companies are working on projects like, it's not even e-education, it's m-educations. In Africa, in many countries, there is no broadband, no computer, no electricity sometimes. But lots of people have mobile phones. Very simple devices, very cheap, $1 per month, limited connection. Think about the power that it would have on the local communities to develop education content that can be delivered through mobile phone. Then you really start reaching out to hundreds of millions of kids who do not have access to education today. Same for central India, where there are a number of problems here. So think about IT not only in terms of laptops, computer, broadband, network. This is one part of the equation. Think about the telecommunication part of it, and also think that IT there is not only the device, it's the content. It's the content which is accessible, which also needs to be multilingual. You mentioned your efforts in Qatar, and that's great, because actually if you look at the Middle East, if I'm not mistaken, 50 to 60% of the population is below 20 or 18 years old. Huge education needs, and remember, to your point, technology is gender neutral. When you sit behind a computer, nobody cares if you are a woman or a man. Nobody can see that. So you can still deliver education to people or to kids today who don't have access to it. So I think that we should really look at technology as a way to reach out to unserved and uneducated today population, and no need to invest billions of dollars in infrastructure. Mobile phones, that as simple as that. And if you look at Ghana, at Kenya, that's where they're going to now. And one comment about what you said that a number of your students, if I'm not mistaken, are not very interested into global issues, right? Well, for those who are in the room, that's a huge mistake, because maybe that you don't care that much about the world, but the US cares very much still about the USA. So a lot of countries still look at the USA as a model for innovation, technology, new ideas. So you should really get engaged into that global programs, because that's where your future is, and because people still, again, look at the US as a good place.
The ones who are here are interested.
All right. So tell your friends.
My concern is the ones who aren't here.
Tell your friends to be engaged.
I'd like to pick up on 2 points that Thomas mentioned, and I'm here kind of as a voice of humanities, but I can't help pick up on the technology for a moment, and that is just yesterday in our graduate research seminar, one of our graduate students is doing work on biliteracy in Bangalore, and she's working with slum children there, and they are so ripe for dealing with technology. They try to get to the internet cafe. They do have TVs when they don't have roofs over their heads, and yet they are really ready to absorb this in that way. And then speaking about your comment about the half of the students perhaps here at the campus that don't seem to show interest, the half that do, at least judging from the close to 50% that are taking modern languages and certainly studying the humanities, these students are getting amazing education to prepare for global citizenship. And those that kind of question the value of the humanities in this day in terms of its applicability, we see that the interdisciplinary nature of the education here really goes a long way.
I think the other thing that's really fascinating about the education topic, and when we at PwC talk about corporate responsibility, it's a combination of everything from community outreach to sustainability to our ethics programs to diversity, kind of the whole gamut of things. And when we look across those 150 territories around the globe and our 150,000 people and try to figure out what are some common denominators that we can talk about, there's one so far that we've come up with, and that's education. Because there's not one leader in any of our network of firms that are out there that don't see where they are anywhere in the globe, education being a key issue to the success of their local marketplace as well as the success of the global marketplace. And I think it's important to look at education very holistically. And so it's one thing to go in and to talk specifically about the training, the courses, technology, the different ways to do it, but I think we also have to realize that there's some things that are standing in the way of education, everything from children not being appropriately nourished to safety issues, just getting children to school. And I think part of the things that we really wrestle with, and we're seeing it in the US, and it's something we have to help people manage across the globe, is a lot of time is spent now, when you think of your days, in K through 12. A lot of time now is spent with children is not learning in the US. Schools now are taught to be the places where you go and we feed you, and it's a safe place to spend that 8 hours a day, and you take extracurricular activities, and those are all great, but there's not as much learning. And we've said, compared to other China and India and other places, we do some things really well, but we're not spending the time teaching, especially in K through 12, as is happening in other places. And so that's really become something that we can talk about globally around PwC. What's happening in the US, as the US certainly takes the lead on some things, but what can we learn? And then how can we use the size and our leverage to then talk to school districts around the country to figure out how we can do it different here? But I think there's a lot of other barriers to education, and you really have to start at that most fundamental young level, because that's what's going to set the stage for the future. And that's really what's going to be what we need to change. So years from now, we're not looking back and saying, gosh, we have the senior vice president position and we need a woman to fill it. That's going to be because you hired somebody 15 years ago and they're suddenly in the place to do it. If you need the person, it's too late. You're not going to get it. So really starting with how can we get more people who are interested in the accounting fields? How can we get more people who were interested in humanities that can join our innovation department? Starting way back then is really going to help us in the future.
I think one of the challenges that I can never forget is that if you look at the UNDP Human Development Report, the most recent one, you find that 18 countries have a literacy rate that is below 50%, way below, and many, many others who are hovering in the 50%. And when you start talking about mathematics and sciences and moving forward, how does one reconcile what is going on in some parts of the world where, yes, I'm glad you talked about the mobile phone, because when we talk about computers, to countries where the electricity is about 2 or 3 hours a day, and I would like to find out how can IT perhaps help in reaching out to the younger population, and whether that is possible, and how is it possible, particularly with the language problems?
Well, I definitely think it's possible. When you look at many kids today, maybe not in the poorest countries in the world, but they have all iPhones or iPods or Xbox. They are online, or they are playing online. We're chatting with friends all the time, and I'm going to maybe to use a cliche, but then they go to the classroom and they come into kind of ossified, maybe boring environment when there is a person on a platform who tells them what to learn. So there is a disconnect here between the way the content is delivered and their daily lives, where it's very interactive, very immediate. They get friends all over the world. It's different. So I think that one of the challenges is to integrate the content, the education content, in a format that actually speaks to kids, and that they can use it and they can benefit from it. And that's the first challenge. But I think that the benefit from IT and ICT, information and telecommunication technologies, is that we can personalize it. The internet is all about you, your own taste, the way you live, the way you spend, the way you behave. IT can actually help personalizing education to the needs of a particular student or a particular group of students, versus having one size fits all approach. And I think that's crucial, but not only for the developing world. Where I come from in Europe, that's also one of the issues. And parents do complain about the fact that their kid get the same education as the other kid, even if their needs are different. Their need as a young individual. So I think here there is a lot of investment to be made by the IT community, because let's be clear, that's a huge market. That's a huge market. And that's one thing. Language content, the local language content is a key question. Again, if you look at the Middle East, less than 4% of the entire internet pages is in Arabic. So that's a huge challenge that we need to address. And the fact that now many companies like Google are buying firms in the Middle East, software companies, to develop content in Arabic, is a very good sign, meaning that we are going to reach out to the population which is underserved today. And because of social considerations, maybe parents don't trust their kids to go to the internet to learn stuff in English. They'd rather have them learn stuff in Arabic on the internet. So yes, there is a content issue, I think, in starting to be addressed, because again, and I'll be very clear, this is money opportunity for companies. So we will do it because there is a market.
I was going to add to that. I think there's like two problems here, right? One is, I know Jerry talked about eds and meds, and there was a very positive spin on it. Let me put a slightly negative spin on eds and meds. If you look at healthcare and education, in about 20 more years, they will be more than half our GDP, which doesn't make sense, right? So the cost of these things is going up really fast. Secondly, people in poor countries cannot afford high-quality education, and I think it is in this context it occurs to me that the program that Jerry laid out, and maybe we should know more about this, the OLI program, which allows for customized education at reasonably inexpensive delivery mechanism, would be of value. Do you think, Jerry, this could be?
Yes, we're betting on that. and it's why we've invested so much effort in this. There's a really interesting question. I think this is relevant to this discussion, and even if it isn't, I hope you'll all think about this. It's what an entrepreneur would call the business model, or a business leader would call the business model. How do you get from the dozen courses we've developed? Suppose you agree these courses are terrific and the world ought to have them. How do you go from the dozen courses to the, say, 1,000 that we need, when you consider that each of those courses has cost like $1 million to put together? And let's suppose we can get the cost down to $100,000. Still a huge amount of money. And so how do you get from the pilot stage to a scaled up stage? And every one of us in this audience, I'm sure, feels that the world deserves, has a right to this education. It ought to be freely available. Certainly, there are foundation people, the private foundation people, who feel strongly that way. We don't disagree, those of us involved in the program, but we ask the question, where's the money going to come from? The foundation community is not going to put up $100 million to create 1,000 courses. That's what the private sector is for, you could say. So if there's a way to commercialize this, maybe companies like SAS are the ones to do it, so that you can raise the capital you need to create the content in the first place. That's, it seems to us, the key. But we haven't figured that out yet. We don't know what the business model is, and you can't ignore it, though.
And I think that that's really critical. We're working with several universities, because one of the things that really links together the humanities and the technology is not just having a course that's in accounting, and when we bring on about 5,000 new accounting majors a year in the US, but they need to have a lot more than just an accounting background. And so how does ethics fit into that equation? How does sustainability fit into that equation? How does globalization fit into that equation? Not just accounting courses. And so we've come in and helped universities to develop courses around corporate responsibility in a more holistic sense, because that's the kind of thinking that we now need as most of our people come in and they're working on multinational clients. And so that's a way to build these partnerships, which is critical, because there's not one group that's going to solve these issues. And so we have to find ways that we can work together with nonprofits and companies and governments to really make a dent in this, because it's too costly and nobody really has the resources to do it on their own.
You mentioned cost as a great challenge, and you also mentioned the word content. And that, I think, is really also a very big challenge, to train people who, as my colleague Steve Brockman said this morning, are sensitive to the particularities of culture, that culture matters. And so to develop products that are going to be successful, and to have people well trained, both language and culture-wise, and in terms of the humanities, have the analytical and communication skills to go with it, is extremely important.
So, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to just say, it's a fair question is whether that's achievable online, totally online.
But I was going to say, I'm being an optimist. I think it's achievable, right? It's for the president to raise the money. No. It's a bad joke. But Susan, back to your point. I think within Carnegie Mellon and some other places, but here for sure, we are looking at changing engineering education to become more holistic and bring innovation, entrepreneurship, technology change, modern languages all into the curriculum, including, you can't hear? Can you hear now? No, this is like broken. Yeah, this is broken. Yeah, now it's because I'm holding the wire. Instead of chewing gum, it's my finger. Holding. Okay. So I was going to say at Carnegie Mellon, we are thinking and working very actively at changing the curriculum to include modern languages, global politics, and all of these current relevant topical areas and issues into a holistic education of this next generation of engineer. That on one hand I argued India and China should graduate more, and now I'm arguing that let them graduate more and we'll go manage their more graduates, because that way we'll have more value creation at our end, right? So we are trying to change our curriculum too, while we are arguing that international community has to be serious about educating more people. So.
No question. We go back to that 8.6% of university students that study languages and cultures in addition to English. We know that English is the lingua franca. At the same time, multilingual corporations are looking for people proficient in languages and cultures and in the humanities to have a broader background, and would like to hire more people of that sort, and it's not, the market is not there.
If I may, I'd just like to go back to your starting point of developing countries, that we tend to be so U.S. and Eurocentric in our thinking for obvious reasons, I guess. We've had quite a bit of experience now in other countries, and of course one cannot and should not lump them all together. So there are countries like India, which we know well, which generates a lot of university level graduates, not nearly enough to support their own economy. And what we hear from their employers, the Indian employers of those students, is exactly what you're talking about, Susan. That is, we figured out how to do technical training, but now that we need people who are customer facing, as they put it, we need people who have language skills and communication skills and management skills. They need a broader sense of the world beyond India. And they realize that their universities simply don't do that now. And there's a big gap there. In addition, they have just an enormous gap between the demand for higher education, as you know, and the supply of it. So that's India, and that's challenging enough. But then you all, some of you know Africa, certainly you know Africa much better than I. But as Thomas made reference to before, we're talking about places that don't have access basically to nothing. So that the state of the educational system in some of those countries is so far away from the notion of an American research university that it's so as to make what we do simply not relevant. And each of these classes, I think, or groups or types of situation requires its own thought, own program to make progress.
One issue that comes to mind, one issue that comes to my mind is actually the educated in those developing countries who end up actually leaving, and the brain drain that is caused by that. So that's one issue, please.
I just wanted to make 2 points. The first, about what you just said about India, we see as a company, we see the same issue in Singapore and South Korea, despite a very high level of development. It's very modern places. The Ministry of Education comes to us and can you help us introduce that dose of humanity in the program. Now, about the business model, that's a very good question. I personally see the start of a new coalition, if you want, between the education world, between the IT world, and between the telecommunication world. Those three start to converge and to realize that, yes, there is possibility to collaborate and to create a new business model, because so far, I agree, it's not very clear who is going to pay what, when, and for what type of content. But I see, for instance, big multinational telecommunication companies like Safaricom in Africa, who serve many countries in Africa, starting to ask IT companies, can you develop that e-content for us so we can deliver on mobile phones? So, and the demand is coming from the telecommunication side, because they see an advantage here to deliver new services. So I'm not saying that it's done and everything is perfect, but I believe that there is possible ways to collaborate even more there. And very interestingly, from my perspective, this is coming from Middle East and Africa mostly, right now.
Questions, exactly.
We've been talking in some ways about essentially decentralizing education in a lot of ways, and currently schools hold a monopoly on education. But at the same time, as you were, should be on. Yeah. But at the same time, President Cohen, you were talking about how much countries look to the American model and for standards. because they know that we have high standards and they know that we can deliver that. So in a decentralized model where you're delivering education through different means, possibly financed in interesting ways with private companies and these kinds of things, how do you keep a level of standards that people know they're going to be able to get a job when they've got that education, or as opposed to a sort of Infosys model where you're essentially training somebody to make up for a shortfall that you're then going to just employ them and use them in that way?
It's a great question. Actually, some of us had a chance to meet privately with Bill Gates yesterday. Randy Bryant, the Dean of Computer Science, the Provost, and I. And it was exactly what we talked a great deal about. He made the point, and it's a very good one, that there basically one way to think about what higher education does or has to do is three things: develop the content, deliver the content, and then deliver the credential. And his observation was, because of technology, those three functions are starting to separate, or may be separable in a way they never were before. That is, to get the Carnegie Mellon credential of a degree, you had to come and live on our campus as the way we delivered our Carnegie Mellon content to you. And technology raises the question of what's going to happen when those things get separated. And we don't have great answers to that, especially the credentialing part of it, the issue you just raised. I'll just point out again another commercial, but I got the mic and I'm the president. One of the great breakthroughs in this open learning technology that we've incorporated is it's very heavy on interaction between the student and the module, the computer. And built into that is real-time assessment of how the student is doing. So you can imagine, and indeed what we anticipate is, there is someone sitting in Pittsburgh monitoring the progress of students in Africa, the Middle East, or wherever they're taking the course. And so that we know how the student's doing. And we also know how to adjust the content, by the way, over time. I mean, not in real time. So there is a way to do credentialing from a distance, but it requires, I think, the institutions that will do the credentialing to think about this in a very different way from the way they used to think about it. And at least speaking for this university, we're not there yet, but we're clearly thinking about it. I think it's a great question.
Jerry, just in reaction to your conversation yesterday, I think you said it was with Bill Gates. I think he might have left some things off that are important to an institution like ours, that we've been talking about education as content delivery. But I think there's more to our education than just raw content or technical content. And part of that is socialization, what is an educated person, but it's also how do you develop thinking models and how do you become a better thinker. And if we strip those out, then I'm not sure we're actually providing the service and the education that we should be doing.
Indeed, it's a great point, Robert. I'm glad you mentioned it. To me, the countervailing forces of separating the three I talked about are two. One is that being residential, and by that I'm using that as shorthand, is having a community of students who study together over time, is very hard to replace through technology at a distance in terms of its value, exactly in the way you said, socialization, broadening of perspective. The other is collaborative research. And of course, at the research university like ours, the connection of that to the educational experience. That's also hard to do at a distance. I'm hesitant to say we'll never be able to figure out how to do that. I'm kind of hoping we don't, because that will really undermine the model of a Carnegie Mellon, maybe. But I'm hesitant to say you can never do that because we're surrounded by some of the great technology minds in the world, and who knows what they'll come up with. But that's a great point. I agree with it completely.
Hi, this is a question for President Cohen. I apologize, distinguished panel. With regard to the open learning program that you're developing. Excuse me?
Your name?
Stephen Taylor. I'm a master's student in the public policy program. With regard to funding, you mentioned that a private partnership is what you're looking at. As someone who's actually worked in a school that was private and for-profit, I saw how there were the conflicting goals of making money and educating students really affected the education. Do you believe that it's impossible or improbable that the scale-up that you were talking about can be funded through the traditional governmental nonprofit channels, like, for instance, through community colleges? They're subsidized by the government, students pay tuition. Is it possible that there can be maybe a slower ramp up, but without the profit motive to increase the number of courses that you can offer?
I hope so, and maybe. Indeed, this next phase we're embarking on with community colleges will help us understand a lot in terms of trying to answer that question. And I respect your point completely about the potential conflict among multiple motives of making money and delivering high quality learning. It's a great point, and we'll see. Our goal is the scale up as opposed to the profit maximization. Whether you need the latter to get to the former remains to be seen. We'd be happy if we could do it otherwise.
May I add something to that? I mean, from the private sector perspective, I think this is something where corporations must look at it from a long-term perspective. If it's in for a quick buck, that's not going to work. This is an investment, because by doing that, we are going to create the workforce of tomorrow that we will need in the USA and everywhere around the world. So it's also a way to ensure long-term sustainability and survival of corporations. But if it's only to make money right now, no, I agree with you, that's not going to fly.
I have a question on a very different topic concerning education. We at Carnegie Mellon work with inner city schools. Some children in those schools, when they go to kindergarten, they're not ready to read. They do not learn how to read. They don't learn math or science. They do not get educated enough to join the global economy. This is Pittsburgh. How about Somalia, Darfur, the slums of India? A child who does not get educated does not join the global economy, which is not good for the world or for them. My question is really to the G20. Do we have an obligation such that every child gets educated? That's the question. Does the G20 feel that obligation? A much, much, much more difficult question is, how do we do it? That's really difficult. Take a child who is 3 years old in a slum of India. That child cannot wait until he or she is 30 years old to get educated. We at Carnegie Mellon have computer science. We heard software being discussed, technology. Perhaps we should invest not just money, because any dollar spent on education gets multiplied. Every parent who pays the tuition at Carnegie Mellon knows that. It is technology. Isn't it time for us to get to work to make sure that every child gets educated? Thank you.
And it's interesting. I do think that there's a commitment around the globe to do that. And I think you're right. The problem is people don't know how to do it. And I think that's where it's the responsibility of all of us to help in that. We're helping roll out a new form of math in the U.S., ST math, spatial temporal reasoning. Is that our specialty? No, but we're being asked to help schools. We're in the process of building 4 schools in Chad and just adopted schools in Belize because they can't do it. And their governments have come and said, can you help us do it? It's not necessarily our responsibility, but it is our responsibility, because that's going to be the future workplace and the future marketplace. And so I think we're all struggling to figure out, what do we need to do and how can we be a part of it? And as more people realize that what you're saying is fundamental to our future and we can't overlook it, I think the more people will be drawn together to work together to figure out, how do we make that change? I do see people committed to it. Again, it's the one thing that brings all of our leaders to the table with pounding fists, but it's the how and what's our play in that. What do we need to do?
Hi, my name's Caroline Kaufman. I'm something of a fossil from Carnegie Mellon because I graduated from here. And I started when it was still called Carnegie Institute of Technology. And I was told right up front by the Dean of Women that the reason this school was started was that Andrew Carnegie needed an educated labor force to man his factories. And that was the raison d'etre. And then after World War II, there was a specific effort to train returning war veterans in basics, algebra, trigonometry, the basic education of that you would need that would produce the next generation of engineers. And I think when we go searching for a business model for how to advance education, maybe that's where we ought to go back. We ought to go back to that sentiment, you know, of that's the reason this whole institution started. It didn't start out to be, you know, a research institution. It started out to educate the basic labor force so that there would be people around who could do the work that Andrew Carnegie and his cohort of Gilded Age industrialists needed to have done. So I think that maybe we could just unpack it and go back to our roots, if you will, and see it, education in that perspective. And the other thought I had is that you can teach typing and basic literacy if a kid is just forced to text message. You know, maybe it won't be the best spelling in the world, but you know, you got to start somewhere. Anyway, I was wondering what the panel's reaction was to that kind of thinking.
Can I start about the second point? I mean, if it's the way kids use, you know, language today, well, and because of technology, or you know, maybe we should adapt to that situation. When I see some of my family, the young kids, how they use French, I'm horrified. But that's their language, and that's going to pose problem when they are going to look for jobs. That's also an issue. But well, maybe we can at least adapt some of the content to the situation, just to make sure that they still get plugged into the education system. Otherwise, we risk losing them. I'm not saying it's good. I'm saying that's there. So maybe it's up to us to adapt some of our habits as well.
Okay, we have 5 minutes and 3 people who want to. Please make sure that your questions are short and quick.
Thank you. My name's Adam Jones. Like Stephen, I'm a master's in public policy student at the Heinz School. And my question surrounds the fact that we talked a lot about bringing technology to these places. My question for all of you on the panel is, how do we keep the human element, whether it be teachers or counselors or whatever, involved in education across the world as our technology use increases?
Why don't we take the other 2 questions and then ask the panel to wrap up? You want to answer one? Okay. This gentleman here.
Okay, hi, my name is Derek Kaser. I'm a student from St. Vincent College that's attending. My question is kind of running back to what we're discussing, the non-traditional forms of education, such as through the open courses that were mentioned or through communication via mobile phones. And my question to it kind of relates back to the concepts of assessment and authentication. Is that, for example, with text messages, they're by nature asynchronous, and so you lose kind of the assessment feature that you get with the open course, where it can actually analyze how students are performing. And my other question is whenever you're doing this and you're handing out credentials with it, how do you authenticate the person on the other end of the connection to know that the person who you're putting their name on the certificate is actually the person who's performing the work?
We'll take a final question from there, and then we'll come back to the panel. That's it. Final. That's it.
Hi, my name is Jose Argueta. I'm from Honduras. I grew up there, and I also grew very concerned with poverty and all the problems that we have over there. So I came to the United States to study, how to make better policies and decisions, and actually that's why I went to Yale University, and President Cohen was my professor in the class of decision making, an excellent class, by the way. And so I learned a lot about how to make better decisions. And I also continue my studies. I got a PhD in political science too, and because I was very concerned about the political situation in my country, and I can say that we have made a lot of progress in terms of political reforms in my country. But there are still some problems that are structural, that are barriers for my country's economic development, and so we need to differentiate between developing countries and developing countries. So you can have developing countries like China or India or Brazil who have made a lot of progress and in industrialization and economic development. But there are also countries like mine, Honduras, Nicaragua, South Saharan countries, African countries, which don't have the leverage or the attractiveness to get foreign investment or to get into the global economy. So my question is, how the new world economy and the process of globalization will help, these, little countries that, lack industrialization and are mostly, agrarian societies, and therefore have been, left behind and out of the global economy. Thanks.
Okay. I would like to.
So actually, I can make it quick. I can answer the authentication question. The simple answer is, yeah, it's indeed possible to do that. The only slight problem with that is that it raises significant issues of privacy and a whole lot of policy-oriented issues. So technically, it's not difficult or impossible to authenticate. But in terms of deploying that authentication mechanism, using biometrics, for example, there's a whole lot of privacy issues that open up that I think we as a society have not given much thought to or as much serious thought to, right? So that's a quick answer to your question. And I just want to make one point to the last question here, and then I'll shut up. I think the way to think about leverage is not to say, oh, I'm a poor country, I don't have leverage. I think about it as a wave of economic expansion that is happening, and it is being attracted by forces of economics, which is basically inexpensive and highly qualified labor to do the same job that is being done at a more expensive place right now. And my instinct or feeling is that education is that force of attraction. So if the country is able to create a highly educated workforce or a reasonably educated workforce over time, you will create the basis to attract that wave of economic expansion to your country. And that's where I'm going to stop.
From the question that's on the personal interaction, we certainly see that as fundamental to the human interaction and what drives relationships. And relationships are really at the core of continuing to build a successful market and being innovative and forging new relationships. And you also need that interaction with principals and with academia and with your teachers in order to push you forward and to let you know that you can do these things. So although technology is something that can certainly take us to the next level, and it does go beyond different barriers of gender and race and language, it does not replace somebody that's there and helping you pass the barriers and helping you to understand the things that you did right and learn from the things that you did wrong and teach you that. Because there's nothing worse than going to a room and having a presentation, whether it's with accountants or others, that don't have that human interaction, because that trust and that loyalty is fundamental to that relationship. And we're seeing that as a higher driver than necessarily how you perform an audit. So that's critical to continue.
I would add to that question, and it's a very complex one about how one addresses and maintains the human dimension, that cultivating an education that really sensitizes one to consciousness of self and other, and to really think about that cross-cultural awareness in addition to the things you mentioned, makes for at least a promising way to forge those two things.
Two last points on my side. To your question, it will never replace human interaction, but for communities who have nothing, like Africa, for instance, it's a first step towards the rest. Authentication, I agree with Pradeep. Technologically speaking, it's very easy, but look again at many African countries that don't have IDs. They don't have IDs. They don't have photo IDs. They don't have pieces of IDs. So yes, you can start with fingerprinting and stuff like that. But indeed, it raises issues. But that can be done. That is done as existing today. Cell phones with a little thumb authentication device. So that's one of the ways to do that. In Kenya, they already do m-banking using mobile phones. So they do money transactions. So certifying students is also possible.
They did such a great job. I'll just say that.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really sorry we went so far beyond when we were supposed to stop, but we did actually get the students to participate, so I'm very happy about that. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you.